A lot of you were very upset when I spoke about Sati briefly in the recent video on the status of women in India. Many agreed with me, but many thought that I was trying to paper over what was an original sin in Indian culture. That apparently our ancestors burnt widows on their husbands' funeral pyres.
It's a story of concoction. This is a total misrepresentation of our Sanskrit sources, Sati as we call it. The actual evidence for this is very few and far between. It's a whole orchestrated campaign in the collected works of William Bentinck, in which he is writing to friends that I have decided when I go to India, I will abolish Sati. You've not set foot in India, you don't know anything about India, and you've already decided to abolish Sati. At that time, when the missionaries were operating, 1/3 of the population died because of British introduced revenue policies. The missionaries never agitated them. How many missionaries were saying that why are people in Bengal dying?
Hi everyone. Have our ancestors been defamed on this subject of Sati? Let's find out. And also, this is an emotionally charged subject and often a misunderstood topic. So this episode will be slightly longer. But this is such an important subject that it deserves our time so that we understand it properly. You might recall Queen Madri from the Mahabharat, who chose to die on her husband King Pandu's pyre, and some other examples too. Firstly, if you have to try so hard to find examples of Sati, then that itself is evidence that it was not a widespread practice which was dictated by our scriptures. Frankly, you don't need to try very hard to find examples of women being burnt as witches in pre-modern Europe, or examples of Africans being bought as slaves by the Turkish or European empires. There will literally be tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of examples. But let's also address the few examples of ancient women who died on their husband's funeral pyre. The reasoning is there in the Mahabharat text itself. Queen Madri's reason for dying on her husband's funeral pyre was not that she was forced to burn herself due to some societal pressure or ancient laws. She did what she did because of personal guilt born out of extreme love, since she believed that she was responsible for her husband's death. Also, it should be noted that the sages gathered at the funeral tried to stop Queen Madri, telling her that her decision would hurt her young sons. What Queen Madri did was basically ritual suicide. And ritual suicide was done by both men and women in ancient dharmic cultures, not just women, men as well. The reasons for a ritual suicide could be many, such as loss of honor, personal guilt, feeling that the karma in this life is done, fulfillment of personal dharma, loss of a loved one, a terminal disease, or many others. This was accepted in ancient Indian tradition, the concept of ritual suicide, just like euthanasia is accepted in the West. But unlike in places like Canada, where there are reports of some doctors encouraging euthanasia to terminally ill patients, this ritual suicide was not encouraged in India. But even if it was not encouraged, it was accepted if the person doing it was sure and they were of sound mind and not under external pressure to do so. I said earlier that even males did ritual suicide in ancient India. For example, Arjun from the Mahabharat, he was prepared to walk into fire and die there due to the wrongful death of his son Abhimanyu and his inability to avenge it, if you recall. I'm sure you recall that. So would we call Arjun's attempt to walk into a burning pyre, Would we call that the male version of Sati? Historically, the great scholar Kumarila Bhatta is said to have immolated himself, male scholar. Why? Because he had fooled his Buddhist guru. He told him that he was a Buddhist. Why? Because he wanted to learn Buddhist scriptures. And in the mind of this great scholar, lying to your guru was a crime, and therefore he immolated himself. Voluntary death for men and women was a part of a broader dharmic context in ancient India, reflecting personal agency rather than enforced ritual. In fact, it happened with our gods too. At the end of the Ramayana, we see Lord Ram performing Jal Samadhi, essentially renouncing his mortal body by entering the river Saryu, a choice rooted in spiritual completion. Some say that Lord Ram's last words as he went under the Saryu waters were Sita, Sita, Sita. Like I said, both males and females gave up their lives by choice in traditional dharmic cultures. Padma Shri Professor Meenakshi Jain presents compelling evidence that challenges the supposed ancient origins of Sati. She highlights that the British colonial narrative, which persists in influencing modern perceptions, created propaganda on this subject to depict Indian culture as barbaric. Namaste, Meenakshi ji. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Meenakshi ji, the first question: the tradition of Sati is held up as, in a way, the original sin of Indian culture, and it's said that it comes from the Vedas. What is your comment on this?
This is a total misrepresentation of our Sanskrit sources. The Vedic source that you refer to is the funeral hymn in the Rig Veda. That funeral hymn says that when a woman loses her husband, she is supposed to sit in front of him, moist her eyes with ghee, and then rise and resume her place in the world. There was no controversy about the injunctions of this hymn until 1795. Now, in 1795, H.T. Colebrook, it's really unfortunate that this sin should be laid at his door because he eventually became a great Sanskrit scholar. So at that time, 1795, he was a young man, and the first work that he translated was this funeral hymn of the Rig Veda, and he misrepresented or mistranslated one word. Agre means first, to Agne means fire. So, this error that he made, he was a young person, this error was immediately pointed out to him by Sir William Jones. Whatever we may think of Sir William Jones, the point is that he was among the great Sanskrit scholars at that time. What is important for us to note is that William Jones pointed this out immediately on the publication of H.T. Colebrook's article. Now, it is absolutely astonishing and astounding that no one should have taken note of William Jones' correction and gone on citing H.T. Colebrook as the first reference to this custom of Sati. Now, we've all heard of P.V. Kane. P.V. Kane was a very important Sanskrit scholar. He wrote the history of the Dharma Shastras, many volumes, and he said that it is possible that Colebrook made this error because the scribe who transferred that copy to him made an error, or that, he got a corrupted text. So the point that we have to note is that the fact that it was a misrepresentation of the funeral hymn was recognized and accepted soon after the publication of H.T. Colebrook's article. Now, why did it continue to hold sway is the question that should interest us.
There's also another aspect to look at. because the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are in many ways the introductory epics to the Indian way of life. And if you look at the list of widows in the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, you don't find the tradition of sati there at all.
At all, at all. None of the wives of King Dashrath immolated. In the Mahabharata, Madri immolated, but Kunti did not. And Madri was requested by so many people present there, don't do it, think of your young children. But she was determined. There is no evidence that she was compelled to do it, which is a story that we hear later on. It was of her own willingness, and so many people requesting her not to do it, keeping in mind the well-being of her young children. And Kunti did not do it. Ravan's, how many widows of Ravan immolated? I mean, the list is endless. And, in the early tradition, sati means the chaste Hindu wife. So, we even use the word today, Sati Savitri. She's the epitome of virtue. And the first sati is Parvati. She immolates not because Shiva was the danger to his life, but because she could not tolerate the insult that her father imposed on Shiva. So there is, this whole emphasis on widow immolation, sati as we call it. The actual evidence for this is very few and far between. I'm not saying that the custom was not there. It was there, but very few.
So, if there were such few incidents of sati, why do our history books, including history textbooks till today, teach sati as it was a standard traditional practice coming from ancient India?
Even today, if you look at a school textbook, we are told that we are grateful to William Bentinck because he abolished sati and female infanticide. Nothing can be further from the truth. If we go by sheer statistics, which is the first evidence that we have of sati, it is at the time when Alexander's armies were going back. So he had a Hindu general, he died in battle, and one of his widows immolated. Now, the Greeks, they were astounded because the first time that they were seeing this, and there is no reason for us to doubt the authenticity of this account. And it also shows that, it was a real surprise to the people. Now, that is in 3rd century BCE, because Alexander's invasion we place around that time. The next evidence that we have of sati is an inscription which you can still see, the Iran pillar inscription. The Iran pillar has many inscriptions, but it is the first recorded instance of sati mentioned over there. So 5th century AD and 3, that is 800 years. That should give us some idea of how rare the custom was. Now you rightly asked, how do we suddenly hear of sati and becomes synonymous with Hindu culture and civilization? You see, the East India Company, when it came to India, it came to make money. At that time, an evangelical movement was starting in Britain. The evangelical movement started in Britain as a reaction to the revolution in France. And the evangelical movement said the reason for the French Revolution is the irreligion propagated by Voltaire. And if we want to prevent such instances in our country, we have to distribute the Bible in thousands, not only in England, but in our colonies. Now, the East India Company said, kindly don't come to our territories. It told the missionaries, we have come to make money, and we are not here to address the so-called evils of Hindu society. Now the missionaries were determined to bring the Bible, so they created a fear psychosis in the British Parliament. Now that pressurized the East India Company to order an official survey of the 3 presidencies of Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. And the results that came were absolutely astounding. Because, and we should not accept the veracity of these figures. That has to be, open to debate. Now, according to this British survey, 95% of the satis were in Bengal presidency. Again, it is surprising. And from Bombay presidency and Madras presidency, they hardly get any returns. In fact, they say this is not prevalent in our presidencies in any significant manner. So, in any case, it's a story of concoction. And the British missionaries in India, they present these figures to Parliament and they orchestrate a real campaign in England. They get signatures, they get pamphlets, they get petitions made to British Parliament. And finally, the British Parliament succumbs, and in 1813, it permits the Baptist British missionaries to operate in East India Company territories. So this is the background. It's a whole orchestrated campaign. And then William Bentinck, we talk about William Bentinck. Before he came to India as Governor General, he had already decided to abolish sati. Can you imagine? There are two letters of William Bentinck in the collected works of William Bentinck, in which he is writing to friends that I have decided when I go to India, I will abolish sati. You've not set foot in India, you don't know anything about India, and you've already decided to abolish sati. And, there are so many counter voices. Abbot de Boy. Abbot de Boy was a French Jesuit missionary. He lived in South India for 30 years. And he wrote letters on the state of Christianity in India. And he said that the Hindus are an unconvertible people. They cannot be converted. And he said, I am amazed at what the Baptist missionaries in Bengal are writing. In 30 years, I have only seen shaven widows. Shaven widows, after the death of her husband, it was the custom in many places that the widow shaved her head, but he does not talk about sati. So all these counters that are there to counter the British missionary narrative, we have unfortunately not taken into account. Last thing that I want to say, in the entire British period, colonial period, millions of people died of starvation. In Bengal itself, at that time when the missionaries were operating, 1/3 of the population died because of British introduced revenue policies. The missionaries never agitated them. How many missionaries were saying that why are people in Bengal dying? This never interested them, or they wrote about it because they were only interested in the evangelization, Christianization of India. We have to accept this fact. And last point, that in the entire colonial period, apart from the missionaries, there was only E.P. Thompson who wrote an article on missionaries. No British official of the East India Company, no historian, nobody wrote. In India, after independence, Parliament figures show 40 cases of immolation in the entire country from the time of independence till today. We regret even one immolation. But the point is that against these 40 immolations, we've had feminist writers producing book after book after book, as if this was a raging evil even then and now. So, this is something that we have to factor in when we talk about sati. So, it is sad that after independence, we have continued this colonial narrative. It is so important to reclaim our past, to write it Hindu India through Hindu eyes.
Two very quick things in the last question, Meenakshi ji. One is that there are those who say that this tradition emerged during the Turkic invasions to protect, like Johar, to protect the honor. Very much like how Yazdi women in the recent past died by suicide to protect their honor from ISIS terrorists. And second, Madri, even in her reasoning in the Mahabharat, did not say that she is committing sati. She was actually feeling guilty that
Yes,
she was
for
the
causing the
cause.
death of her. Yes.
Yeah, that she was the cause of her husband's death.
Yeah. So we have to keep in mind that sati is an individual case, whereas Johar is collective immolation. And collective immolation takes place when the body of women over there are feeling threatened. Their existence is feeling, they feel that they are under threat. So we have two recorded cases of Johar. Sati is always individual, Johar is always collective. So we have two instances of sati in the colonial period, in the Mughal period. One is when Alauddin Khalji attacks Chittor, and the second is when Akbar attacks Chittor. So these are two instances of Johar which have been recorded.
And on Madri, do you agree with that interpretation? That wasn't
Yes.
really sati.
No, she said that I have caused the death. So I don't want to live.
Thank you, Meenakshi ji.
Thank you.
Chalo. The narrative we've been fed has served colonial interests more than representing a historically accurate portrayal of ancient India. I'm not saying that everything about our past was great. I'm not saying that. Yes, there were many things that were wrong. And traditions which need to be questioned should be questioned. But let's not believe colonial lies about our ancestors. Our ancestors were not as bad as the British Raj made them out to be. Our ancestors did not prescribe widow burning in our scriptures, but instead often prescribed for widows to move ahead with their lives even after their husband's death. Now, if you are aware of any other colonial lies that were fed to us Indians, please drop comments below. And I hope I've managed to answer some of the doubts and questions that were raised by many of you on this subject of sati. Thank you. So this was the Immortal India podcast with me, Amish. If you enjoyed this episode, like and share it, please. And if you want to receive the notification for the next episode, click subscribe, please. Thank you.
This podcast is supported by the Dilip Piramal Foundation. The Dilip Piramal Foundation is an initiative by renowned industrialist Dilip Piramal to support dharmic causes across India and the world. In this aim, the foundation has supported art galleries, documentaries, dharamshalas, education, and many other such initiatives.